As I was saying earlier, this is the last chapter as far as testing is concerned. There are 2 additional chapters. They're more involved for people that want to move on to intermediate micro or intermediate macro. It's your choice. I'll have some other options available for those individuals that are not looking at those chapters or have questions about those chapters. Main thing this week is get your paper completed, make sure it's proofread, make sure it's formatted correctly. Look at all the examples that I give you in Blackboard in the policy analysis tab. There's no reason not to have it properly formatted. If you don't have anybody that can proofread it for you, use grammar check. And I just want a good paper. Make sure it's a readable, good paper. That makes my life so much easier. Okay, any questions? All right, this chapter we're dealing with today is poverty and inequality. And it's like a passage or a statement I read. It was posted at the Einstein Library on a blackboard. And it says, we only know what we know when we're here and where we're at. When we think of poverty in the U.S., it's completely different from what true poverty is around the world. And we're somewhat oblivious to it. And we have such a large safety net that there's avenues and assistance, even if you're drug addicted or whatever, to get some form of assistance to survive. And the picture I'm going to share the screen, and there's a picture that's up there that truly personified real poverty and suffering. And some of you may have seen it before. It's the child and the buzzard. This was taken in Africa by a gentleman named Kevin Carter. He won a Pulitzer Prize for this photograph. What it represents is a young girl that is traveling with her mother to a food station to get food rations for their basic survival. The child was tired, couldn't go any further, stopped, and bent down to this position. It appears that the child was praying, with the buzzard just waiting yards away. Kevin took a lot of pictures and moved around and so forth, and he did shoo away the buzzard before completing all his photographs. But we don't see pictures like this in the United States. We don't see people at this level of suffrage. This is poverty. This is suffering. And if we go back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, at the very beginning, the platform, the base of being, you have to survive. Making friends, being social, protecting others that cannot protect themselves, all that comes as you move up Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as an individual, as a group, or as a nation. In this situation, in similar situations, in Africa and other nations, we see young men and women, primarily young men in Somalia, going out on wooden boats to hijack tankers and ships. And you wonder why they do it. It's because their life expectancy is about 40 to 50 years of age. and there's nothing else. If they make $1,000, that's 10 years, 20 years worth of wages in their country. So a person is only motive is to survive. It changes how you respond to external forces. Kevin Carter, not long after this picture was taken, after he won the Pulitzer Prize for it, took his own life. He said he had seen all the suffering he could stand to see in one lifetime. So there's another, trying to get this thing to back out. I'll deal with that in a moment. But if you've seen God Grew Tired of Us, the young individuals in Sudan, the government, it was wars based on religious position, and all the Christians were to be executed, and women were to be taken into slavery, and the men killed, and the boys. All the boys were to be killed because they didn't want to end up fighting them 10, 20 years later. That was the objective of the government. And in doing that, a group of young men, thousands of young men, fled for safety. They fled for safety. They traveled about 1,000 miles on foot, drinking urine, eating dirt, whatever it took to survive. But in the video, they actually show some of the children as young adults and teenagers coming into the U.S. And it looks at some of the things that they just don't understand about the resources we have. The first time they go in a grocery store, they go into a hardware store. They never saw anything like that, or an inside bathroom. So when we talk about poverty, I really like to start off just showing what real poverty looks like. In this chapter, it focuses on how much inequity and poverty exists in our society. And remember, we have to, like I said, take into consideration what we perceive as poverty and suffering. What are the problems measuring inequality? What are supposed to be leading philosophies on the proper role of government in altering the distribution of income? And what policies are used to fight poverty? And what are the problems with these policies? These are the things we're going to discuss from this chapter. It kind of takes us into a global perspective, not just looking at our local area, Johnson County or Eastern North Carolina or North Carolina or the South or the North or the United States or North America. I mean, we can find inequality and poverty everywhere, even to an extreme. There's not equity between Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos. Bezos has got billions of dollars more than Zuckerberg. We're not going to focus on that. We got to look at the lower income levels within the United States. That's what this book likes to look at. In a free market, there's never going to be equity where everything is shared equally. The only way that happens is in the command society where they tell you what you receive, period. They tell you whether you get potatoes or steak, a hut or an apartment or a house. At least, free market, we have the ability to make choices. We just expressed our greatest characteristic when we voted last week. Doesn't matter whether I agree or disagree with anyone. I want everybody to vote. It's one of the privileges that you have. But in some of these countries, that does not exist. Where the young girl was sitting there waiting to die and buzzard right behind her. They weren't worried about voting or the next runoff or anything else. It was basic survival. Now, we talked about the earnings of individuals, and there's different reasons why there are separations in income. You go on a pro football team, they got people making the minimum, and they got people making hundreds of millions of dollars, and it's out of skill, and it's just natural ability. They have the human capital. They have individuals just by chance that they win more. We talked a little about discrimination in the past chapter, where the study took place involving African American names versus names that were familiar to Caucasian individuals. They sent out the resumes. They were exactly like, just different names. There was discrimination. Even if there was one case, discrimination exists, whether it's intended or unintended. It exists. So in income distribution or redistribution, it's like I think I gave you a story to read early in the semester about the tax system explained in beer, where the 10 gentlemen drank beer every day, no problems, and the 10th person paid for over 50% of the beer. The bottom percentage, 20, 30%, paid nothing or $1 for their consumption. There was nothing wrong until they got a reduction in what they paid in the beer, and as they started dividing up the windfall, that's when everything kind of went haywire. What should have made everything better actually made it worse, because individuals believe that equitable distribution. And then the next thing you knew, they beat up the rich guy, and he left, and they didn't have enough money to drink beer anymore. So the labor market earnings make up about 2/3 of the total income in the country. So when you work and earn and spend money, you represent about 2/3 of the economy. And you do have individuals building and supplying these goods. That's important to understand. And the companies that are building and supplying these goods are also acquiring factors of production from the workers, from the shareholders, either through rent, interest, or wages. When you look at Amazon, when they entered the building, they started building warehouses all over the U.S. and distribution centers all over the U.S. A lot of the local economies paid them or deferred taxes for them to come in, which is what made it very attractive for Amazon to move. And the reasoning behind that, they may have given a $10 million reduction in taxes as an incentive. If they hire 10,000 workers at an average of $50,000 a year, that's a lot of money coming back into the economy. And you're going to see taxes paid all the way up the board with it, because if you buy a car, the salesman gets paid, the mechanics get paid, the managers get paid, and then they spend money. And they're also taxed. So when we look at the majority of where the tax revenue is generated in the U.S., it's generated through work and income taxes. As far as the federal is concerned, state taxes is usually sales tax plus a state tax, an income tax, and then the local is usually property. Now, what we have to look at is resource allocation in the process in the free market. I had a student about a long time ago. She was writing her paper on the inequities in the North Carolina public school system. And she was comparing Wake County to 3 impoverished counties to see if there was the resources were equitable. She actually traveled to the counties. One in northeastern North Carolina, it was either Berkeley or Martin. She went down to Fort Lumberton, and she went to West, up in the mountains around Mitchell County, in that area. And when she finished gathering all her sources and interviews and everything else, she realized that even though we're in the same state, there was a huge difference in the educational systems between just counties within the state. You had some that, they didn't have the computers, they didn't have internet, they didn't have anything. Whereas in Wake County, they did have that material, they did have that equipment, and the students thrived because of it. Doesn't mean there's not any individuals in the poorer counties that don't excel. But if they had the proper resources and there was an equitable distribution of the resources, they would be on the same playing field as the ones in Wake, Chatham County, the richer counties within the state. Now the government gets in there and says, okay, we're going to redistribute. But just focusing on the educational system in North Carolina, the government says, we're funding education. And they fund the teachers' pay, etc. But the resources on the local level are through property taxes. They're covered by the local government, such as the building, the grounds, and the equipment. And you can go to some of these more impoverished counties, and their oldest school, their newest school, is probably older than the oldest school in Johnson County, Wake County. So there's a big split in the redistribution. And part of it is because in North Carolina, we have about 100 school districts. Each one has their own boards of education. They have their own school administration and departments. It's hard to distribute everything equitably when everybody is so scattered. The actual school systems are made up of the counties, and the counties were designed to be one day's ride to and from the county seat to any location. I think we're a little beyond that right now, as far as being able to travel to and from. We can go to Europe in an afternoon. It's a long flight, but we can do it. The conditions that existed then when they divided up the state are not the same as they are today. But we're still using the outdated floor plan. So when we measure inequality, how much inequity is there in our society, how many people live in poverty, what problems arise in measuring the amount of inequality, and how often do people move between income classes. There are some countries, there's no movement between income classes. The hierarchy is already set. If you're highly motivated and the resources are available by chance or by effort, in a free market, you can acquire wealth, or at least a level of satisfaction that you're doing better than your parents or your parents and your grandparents, etc. So there is movement available within the economy. Now, if we look at the United States income distribution, this is in 2017. The bottom quintile is under 24,827. Now, if you're in the bottom quintile, that is the cash annual income. Now, it doesn't include all the benefits like Medicaid, WIC, SNAP, all those that are available. Second quintile is probably also drawing on those funds. So this is the income part, not necessarily the total number of resources or value the resources received. The middle quintile is 47 to 77. Fourth quintile is 77 to 126, and top quintile is 126 605 and over. In the top 5% is 244,000 and over. I wouldn't mind being in there and having that level of income. But I would be happy here or here or here. We have happy families and communities where we don't see that much wealth. So it's not necessarily a measure of happiness, but this is the breakdown of money as far as income. Inequality measures, they got the quintile ratio, the income received by the richest quintile of the population divided by the income of the poorest quintile. And when we look at that and how it's set up, if we're looking at this, this is time. This is income. This is the origin, which is 0, 0. We're not going negative. So if the lower quintile is here, over time, and the upper quintile is here, and it's increasing as well, yes, the gap does exist between the upper and lower quintile, and it is getting greater. Now, is this increasing? Yes, but at a decreasing rate. And this is increasing over an increasing rate as well. But when we talk about income distribution, and that's what we're looking at here, I would be more concerned if there was no separation. But it's never going to happen, because when we look at economic growth, both of these have to increase. Now, the rate of increase, once you reach this level, it's going to increase at a much faster pace. But my biggest concern is that that decrease was caused by this lower group moving downward. If it's moving downward, that's when I have the greatest problem. Because then it's telling me that the economy is just not working. Back in the early 20th century, we had all the robber barons, we had all the monopolies. There was a big difference between the Vanderbilts and the coal miners. That gap still exists. Now, if we had a situation and we were in a command society, everybody of your position It could be doing the same thing. And if we take all the funding from everyone, say we tax this group at say 100%, we will see some increasing to some degree, but over time we're going to see this curve moving downward because the individual's willing to risk everything they own, their effort, their time, the energy, for no return. They're going to go away. They're going to find somewhere else to go. I think we watched the video in Sweden. In Sweden, they incorporated some of those policies back in the 70s, and it was one of the leading advocates for those changes was an author. I can't remember her name. She was an author of young children, teen books. And she was very successful, and she was comfortable when these policies went in force. And she was no more uncomfortable after they were enforced because she'd already earned that money. But when she published her next book, she found out the impact of those new changes intended to create equity in the society. She actually ended up paying. The book was a bestseller. But everything she earned from it went to taxes and plus some additional funds out of her own account had to go to pay those taxes. So she actually paid money to have a best-selling book and put it in the marketplace. And at that time, she was no longer a very active cheerleader for the new change. Now, if we look at the share of income in the top quintile, we see an increasing since 1970. Up to this period of time, and right in this area here, is where we saw a huge change in the tax policy. Back in the 50s and 60s, we were looking at about 90% income tax at the top quintile. And here we started seeing it being reduced, 70, 50, and right now it's, I think, 21. But you just have to remember, 21% of $1 billion is $210 million. 21% of $10,000 is $21, $210. So if the individual is running a business or generating wealth, they are paying taxes. And their businesses are paying taxes because they match the corporate tax. They have to match the income tax for their employees. You can see this growth started occurring as this rate started going down. It was because people were interested in taking risks. It was worth the effort to take the risk to acquire and accumulate wealth. When we look at inequality around the world, we clearly see South Africa is still dealing with this major issue. You look at the inequity between the wealthy and the poor. Brazil and Venezuela are there. The United States is listed at 9.4%. Now in Pakistan, you see the inequity is at 4.4%. But guess what? The majority of the population is in poverty. Sweden is a lower number, but you don't hear of a lot of technological advances coming out of Sweden. So when we see this number, we have to look deeper than just what kind of system they have in place. Look at Ethiopia and Philippines. They're all lower than the U.S. But their economies are nowhere near where the U.S. economy is at. And they don't have the safety nets that we have for the individuals that are living at the poverty line or trying to get out of poverty. If you go to Pakistan and some of these countries, there's no avenue to generate wealth or move from one class to the next. You are who you are, and that's where you stay. The poverty rate is changing constantly. We can look that number up and see what the poverty rate is for a family of four. Probably between $25,000 and $30,000, or probably more than that. It doesn't mean you can't survive at that rate. But what is available, you have your earned income tax credits, you have other government assistance to help individuals that are working in that area as far as poverty is concerned. The government sets the poverty line. Their basis is the cost of supplying an adequate diet 3 times. It depends on the size of the family and adjusted every year to account for changes in the level of prices. So if we have increasing price levels, so if price levels increase 20%, so will the poverty line threshold. Normally you don't see the withdrawals, because if we have a situation where we're in a recession and price levels are actually falling instead of increasing, you don't see the decrease in the benefits, in the thresholds. It's usually only on an up position. U.S., the median household income is at $75,938. That was 17. I think right now it's close to 83,000. Since the poverty rate is 12.3, the number there was actually declining between 17 and 19. Poverty line for a family of 4 was 25,000. 17, so that's a little lower than I expected. But if you're at the poverty line at 24,858, you qualify for benefits. And 39.7 million people are living in poverty. What they don't do is give you the households living in poverty. This represents men, women, husband, wife, wife, children in the household, parents in the households. And normally if you have your parents or a single parent is in poverty, the children are also listed in poverty because they're within the household. Poverty over time. There was this great war on poverty. It started somewhere in the 60s, around Lyndon B. Johnson presidency. And we can see that we've had a huge impact on the poverty level in the U.S. Now, if you're a statistician and you're looking at these numbers, that's my pen. We're a statistician, and we see the averages dropping in here. But what we're going to look at is the period from here to here, which is a pretty good period of time. And if we do the averaging, and we have our upper control limit and our lower control limit, and this is our X bar. And we have variation. There's variation in every system. It doesn't matter what it is. It may be producing widgets or golf clubs or peanuts. There's always variation involved. But if we look at as a statistician, looking at the data that is presented here, I would say that this is functioning as it is designed. Now, if we we can pull a graph and just go from this area to this area. We can say that it was a huge increase in poverty over that period of time, looking at about 5 years. I can make data say whatever I want it to say. Now, if I'm being honest, I want to take the whole period. that I'm measuring, where the system was the same across a large period of time. And the only way to change anything where you have somewhat of a stable system in place is to change the system. So currently in the U.S., this is our norm. It appears to be. We have periods of up, we have periods of down. Up and down is a cyclical environment. You can see that in these periods of time, we had recessionary periods. This was back in the period with the oil embargo. There's a recession here. There's a slight recession here. And this is the recession we saw with the housing bubble. Now we see those numbers decreasing again. The only way you change this is to change the system. And if you change a lot of things, you may not see any change at all. It's like if you're doing an experiment on growing corn, you want to control all the external variables. And if you say, well, okay, I'm going to see if I can make it grow better. So you just throw out fertilizer, you throw out water, varying sunlight, and you don't control those external variables. You may see growth, but you may actually kill the plant. But you will not at the end be able to tell what made that change. So if we make a lot of changes to this system, it may go up or down, but we're not going to know which one led to the increase or the decrease. Poverty is correlated by race. Blacks and Hispanics, more than twice as likely to live in poverty as whites. Poverty is correlated with age. Children are more likely than average to be members of poor families. Elderly are less likely than average to be poor. Poverty is correlated with family composition. Families headed by a single mother are about 5 times as likely to live in poverty as families headed by a married couple. That goes back to what we discussed several months ago. If you want to start off in poverty and stay there, if you're a female single parent without a high school diploma, this is a very difficult position to get out of. I know some strong women that have exceeded the worst and become very strong leaders in their community. One young lady, she now owns a bunch of dry cleaners. The other was a legislative liaison for the governor of North Carolina for about 15 years. She did quite well. They both did. But they came out of this position. So there is mobility. Is it easy? No. They had a very tough time. They persevered and they changed their condition, their situation. Both were African American women and single mothers. This poverty rate by group is just a numerical representation of what we saw written out on the previous slide. All persons at 12.3%, white 8.7%, black 21.2%, 18.3%, 10%. Children under 18 is 17.5%. The elderly is 9.2%. Married couples 4.9%. Female household is 25.3%. And this is not applying any racial characteristics to it. Female households, period, 25% are living in poverty. When we look at the changes of how to measure, we can sit there and say, Johnny earns $50,000 a year and Paula earns $2 million a year. And that's not equitable. But we've got to look different than that. Because let's say next year he started at 50,000, now he's at 100,000. She went from 2 million to 10 million. Her rate of increase was greater than his, but both increases. Their standard of living would change. That's where we get in this degree in inequality. And if we base it on the annual income of families, we don't get a whole picture. It's like with when we look at the impact of raising minimum wage to $15 an hour. There will be jobs cut, but it's not affecting most of the family incomes. A lot of the individuals, about 50% of the ones working at minimum wage, live in households that earn in excess of $100,000. They're just getting extra cash. So we have to be careful when we just say that, if we raise minimum wage, there won't be change in the unemployment rate. There won't be a lot of change, but the people that are hit the hardest, which would be the 50% that are not in a $100,000 a year household, those would be the ones having trouble. For example, there's always unintended consequences. When they first passed the Affordable Care Act, they redefined what part-time and full-time were. And there were individuals that were listed as part-time that were putting in 30 to 40 hours a week. But the government came in and said, anybody working 30 hours a week with pay will be considered full-time, and you have to cover them in insurance. So a lot of individuals were not impacted by it, but there was a large percentage of individuals that were at that lower income level that were working two jobs, 40 hours in one job and 20 hours in one at night, at least 60 hours or even 80 hours a week to get by. But when that 30-hour came in and it mandated that anybody that was over 30 hours a week has to be covered on your health care policy, or you have to kick in some money for the federal funding, the Affordable Care Act, businesses, they eliminated that 30 hours. They wanted to make sure nobody worked 30 hours. Now, the individuals that was working two jobs at 80 hours or 60 hours to get by, now they're having to find 3 and 4 jobs. So that's part of the chaotic theory. There's always unintended consequences that occur. And when we start measuring, we have to understand the situation and the big picture. The way people perceive poverty in Johnson County is different than what they perceive poverty to be in Miami or Beverly Hills. It's based on your surroundings. You go to Beverly Hills and they feel sorry for someone that doesn't have a Mercedes or a Beamer. It's just who they are, where they are, and what is around them. That's what they perceive. Now we have transitionary changes. They don't necessarily affect the standard of living. The family's ability to buy goods and services depends largely on permanent income. And a permanent income is a person's normal income. I consider the income I make from teaching this class as permanent income. I'm on a yearly contract. It has to be revised every year. I'm not tenure track or anything else. I consider permanent income. When I retire, I get my retirement benefits. That's going to be my permanent income. But there are some transitional changes that, they don't necessarily have to affect the standard of living. You could just make it more comfortable. When we start measuring, we have to be careful. Economic mobility. We're seeing this a lot in some states where they have implemented high tax rates. We're seeing the migration of wealth. And they talk about the people that are leaving New York City because of the increased tax rates. The problem is, New York City depends on this money to provide the benefits for their entire population. And when it's as if they don't realize that the top 10% feel like they don't have to be there. They have individuals that are retiring with $100,000 pensions a year. Their standard of living is not real good up there in New York City, and they're taxed at a higher rate, property taxes, everything else. They can move down to North Carolina or South Carolina, get a beautiful house, and actually improve their position because they were mobile. It reduces their tax burden. They have more disposable income. So a lot of people do that. It's like the analogy with the tax system on beer, described in beer. Once they beat up that 10th person, the wealthiest in the group, the next day they assumed that he'd show back up. And he took his money and everything else somewhere else. He found a new group of friends that didn't want to hurt him or beat him. So I think I talked about it last class. When I received resumes for individuals that wanted to work with the airlines, if they checked that box, not willing to relocate, their application was thrown in the trash. Economic mobility is huge. I know individuals that are living in Johnson County that do not want to leave Johnson County to find a new job in Raleigh. But then they complain about the low wages they're getting in Johnson County. Mobility makes a difference. We look at the teachers in the public school system, they're all state employees. And they receive the same salaries based on the years of service. But they also receive subsidies and bonuses. They don't get bonuses and subsidies in Martin Berry County. Lake County, Chatham County, they're probably $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 a year. If I want to teach and I want to make the most money, that's where I'm going to find a job at. You don't see the individuals in Raleigh say, okay, I'm going to give up my position here to go help out in Bertie County or so forth. No. And even the residents, if they get their degrees, they are relocating as well. You see that it's not a money mobility issue. It's an educational issue. You see individuals that acquire wealth and then they just move away. So no one receives any benefit through taxes or whatever. This is not abnormal. They have the problem in Bertie, Martin County, and to some degree in Wake and Chapel Hill and so forth. People are looking, as their incomes rise, they look at the other side of the fence. The greener pastures is what they're looking for. Now there's question about what the government should do. And there's some political philosophies that are founded on the redistribution of income. You have the utilitarianism, liberalism, libertarianism. Because of diminishing utility, this is something we looked at earlier, utility being the measure of satisfaction. We can't take everything. And let's say we take 10% of the income of a wealthy individual. That 10% doesn't represent as much as it does to someone that's making $25,000 a year. Because if you're making $25,000 a year, you're on the poverty level, and when they take 10%, that's $2,500. That's several months of groceries that are being removed via taxation. So you feel it really hard. Now, if you're Bill Gates and they tax 10% and you transfer over $500 million, it doesn't hurt as bad. The satisfaction level does not reach a point where he's just absolutely dissatisfied and sad. He's got everything he needs. Now, the utilitarians do not advocate equalizing incomes. What they're looking at, because it would reduce the total income of everyone due to incentive effects and efficiency loss. Like I said, if you tax Gates, Bezos, and all them at 100%, one, they wouldn't live in the United States anymore. They would be relocating very quickly. Then all of their, or any benefits could be received from their income would be lost. So the utilitarians don't think about it. They think about that. And they know that if it's too much, it'll actually have negative effects on all parties. Liberalism, the government should choose policies deemed just by an impartial observer behind a veil of ignorance, which means they don't know what's going on, and it just sounds like that's the good thing to do. Now, that behavior, that philosophy does have challenges. It does impact motivation and utility. If you take $1 million from Bill Gates and you give $1 million to the person that's making the least money in Johnson County, they're going to get more satisfaction than Bill Gates will get dissatisfaction. But at some point, like the utilitarian system looks at it, it's going to have an impact. But with liberalism, they say, well, this is create the greatest benefit by just taking the money from X and giving it to Y. And without really looking at the big picture. Max minimum, government should aim to maximize the well-being of society's worst off people. No problem with that, period. None at all. There has to be a safety net. If you look at the young lady that we saw in the opening picture, that safety net was not there. The safety net was death. Liberalism calls for more redistribution than utilitarianism. It's still not complete equalization of incomes. Now, there's been a discussion about energy and fracking and so forth. If there's a reduction in the output of the United States, and global output is diminished, which means the price of oil is going to go up. And the person that's going to suffer the most are the people on lower incomes. They're not buying the new fuel-efficient cars. They're not buying the Teslas and so forth. They're not buying the new Hummer EV. Even though it's intended to be everybody pays a fair share on that. Problem is, Bill Gates is not worried about it. He's still flying around those private jets. So is look in Hollywood, a lot of them own their own jets and they fly around. That's not the most fuel efficient or environmentally friendly thing to do. I think the young lady that traveled from Europe to the U.S. on a sailboat to show her passion for additional power resources and use of power, nature to travel. And the big thing was her carbon footprint was supposedly zero going from A to B, from Europe to the United States. The problem was a lot of her friends and supporters flew in on private jets from Europe to the U.S. It kind of negated that gain. Now, we talk about social insurance. Absolutely, we need it, but we have to be mindful. When we build these huge systems, sometimes it costs more to distribute a dollar than a dollar's worth. Libertarianism, basically the government should punish crimes and somebody just get out of the way. And normally if the parties that are involved have the ability to negotiate freely, they'll find a better income, a better outcome. And if the government comes in there and says, you do X. So we look at this chapter, it's going on and on. It's talking about the minimum wage laws. We've discussed it before, welfare. These are the benefits that are in our system. The young lady, the original picture we saw, she don't see that. And here's your critics and proponents. A lot of you are writing papers on this type thing. So just as you go through this chapter, there's a lot of things that they touch on. It's more qualitative than quantitative, unless you're looking at the calculation of the numbers on something like this. So just be mindful of that. Get these two chapters taken care of, 19 and 20, and get your paper turned in. And I think at the beginning of next week, I'm going to give an opportunity for each of you to improve your scores in this class. So let's get everything done, and all that's left is our test and whatever thing I'm going to offer is that comes up on Monday. Okay? Any questions, comments, concerns, likes, dislikes? If not, well, you're free to leave. Go get your paper in. Said as soon as I read the paper and post grade, you'll see your paper disappear out of Blackboard. Okay. Have a good day.